rather go to war in a fortress that crawls or a race car made of glass? It's a question that has plagued military engineers for over a century. Imagine you are a tank commander. You have 3 wishes, but the genie only grants you 2. You can have firepower, a gun big enough to smash anything in your path. You can have protection, armor thick enough to laugh off enemy fire. Or you can have mobility, the speed to outflank, outrun, and outmaneuver your opponent. This is the iron triangle of tank design: firepower, protection, mobility. For decades, nations have gambled the lives of their crews on which of these 3 matters most. And for a long time, one seductively dangerous idea captured the imagination of generals around the world: the idea that speed is armor. The theory sounds perfect. If you are fast enough, you don't need heavy steel plating. If you can move like lightning, the enemy can't hit you. Speed becomes your shield. But does it actually work? Today, we are going to tear apart the history of the fast tank. We are going to look at the machines built for velocity, from the flying tanks of the Soviet Union to the British cruisers that tried to race across the desert. We will look at the times when speed saved the day and the brutal moments when the concept of speed as armor led to absolute disaster. Some of these machines were engineering marvels, others were death traps. This is the story of the need for speed. The physics of velocity. So, what actually makes a tank fast? It sounds simple, just put a bigger engine in it, right? But moving a 30-ton block of steel across a muddy field at highway speeds is an engineering nightmare. To understand the obsession with speed, you have to understand the math. It all comes down to the power-to-weight ratio. This is the golden number. It's the amount of muscle your engine generates relative to the fat it has to carry. The power comes from the engine, torque to get you moving, and horsepower to keep you moving. We aren't talking about a Honda Civic engine here. We are talking about beasts like the Rolls-Royce Meteor, an engine derived from the Spitfire fighter plane. But power is half the battle. The enemy of speed is weight. A tank is by definition a hulking lump of metal. To make it fast, you have to shed pounds. You can make the tank smaller, but then your crew can't breathe. You can use lighter metals for the internal components, but eventually you face the hard choice. To go fast, you have to sacrifice the heavy bits. You have to sacrifice the ammunition storage. You have to sacrifice the big gun. And most critically, you have to sacrifice the armor. And then there is the terrain. Going fast on a road is easy. Going fast over craters, trenches, and tree stumps requires a suspension system that can absorb punishment without shaking the crew into a jelly. Now, when we say fast, we have to be realistic. We aren't setting land speed records. In World War II, a standard medium tank, like the famous American Sherman or the German Panzer IV, would happily trundle along a road at about 25 miles per hour. Off-road, maybe 12. So, for this story, when we talk about fast tanks, we are talking about the outliers, the machines designed to leave those standard tanks in the dust, the vehicles built to exploit a gap in the enemy line and wreak havoc before the enemy even knew they were there. The cavalry crisis and the whippet. To understand why generals wanted fast tanks, we have to go back to the mud and misery of the First World War. The first tanks ever built, the British Mark I and the French behemoths, were painfully slow. They moved at a walking pace, but that was fine. Their job wasn't to race, it was to crush barbed wire and sit in front of machine guns so the infantry could advance.
But there was a problem. Once those heavy tanks smashed a hole in the German lines, they were too slow to keep going. They couldn't push deep into enemy territory to cut off supply lines. For centuries, this had been the job of the cavalry. Horses were supposed to gallop through the breach and cause chaos in the rear. But in 1917, you couldn't send horses against machine guns. At the Battle of Cambrai, the tanks smashed a massive hole in the German defenses, 5 miles wide. But the cavalry couldn't get there in time to exploit it. The gap closed. The opportunity was lost. The generals realized they needed a mechanical replacement for the horse, a cavalry tank. Enter the medium Mark A, known as the Whippet. By modern standards, the Whippet was a joke. It did about 8 miles per hour, but compared to the heavy tanks of 1918, it was a Ferrari. It was 4 times faster than its heavy cousins, and it proved the concept worked. In April 1918, a pack of 7 Whippets managed to break through. They used their speed to outflank enemy artillery. They ambushed 2 entire battalions of infantry, causing absolute carnage. They shot down or ran over hundreds of enemy soldiers simply because they could move faster than the Germans could react. This was the drug the generals were looking for. Battlefield success through pure mobility. And once they had a taste of it, they wanted more.
Hit the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you.
The war ended, but the obsession with speed was just beginning. In the 1920s, an American engineer and ex-racing driver named J. Walter Christie changed the game. Christie understood something no one else did. Power is useless if your suspension breaks. If you drive a tank fast cross-country, the violence of the movement will smash the machine and the crew to pieces. Christie invented a suspension system using massive coil springs and large road wheels. It allowed for huge vertical movement. The wheels could bounce up and down over bumps while keeping the tank stable. His prototype, the M1931, was a revelation. It weighed 10 tons and could hit 40 miles per hour on the road. Cross-country, it could do 25. That was twice as fast as anything else in the world. It even had a trick up its sleeve. You could take the tracks off and run it on its wheels like a car to go even faster. The US Army, however, hated Christie. He was difficult, stubborn, and rude. They turned him down. But the Soviet Union was watching. They were desperate for modern technology. Using a bit of spycraft and deception, they bought 2 of Christie's tanks, labeled them as tractor parts, and shipped them to Russia. The Soviets took Christie's racing car suspension and built the BT series of tanks. These machines were fast, dangerously fast. The BT-37 weighed 15 tons and could hit 53 miles per hour on the road. The Soviets loved to show them off. There is old propaganda footage of BT tanks literally flying, launching off ramps and jumping over rivers. It looked spectacular, but it wasn't just for show. The Soviets were developing a doctrine called deep battle. The idea was to punch a hole in the front line and then flood the enemy rear with swarms of these high-speed tanks to surround them. In 1939, against the Japanese army, the BT tanks proved that speed could kill. They were too fast for Japanese anti-tank gunners to track. They encircled the enemy and won a decisive victory. It seemed that the speed is armor theorists were right. But there was a catch. The BT tanks had paper-thin armor. If you could hit them, they exploded. By 1941, when the Germans invaded, the BT tanks were obsolete, but their DNA lived on. The suspension and the speed of the BT series evolved into the most famous tank of the Eastern Front, the T-34. The T-34 kept the speed, 33 miles per hour, but added sloped armor and a big gun. It proved that you didn't have to choose only speed. You could have speed, armor, and firepower if your design was brilliant enough. The British cruiser disaster. While the Soviets were refining their designs, the British were having an identity crisis. In the 1930s, the British Army was torn between the old guard, who loved horses, and the new guard, who loved machines. To keep everyone happy, they split their tank force into two types. First, the infantry tanks. These were like the Matilda, slow, heavily armored, designed to walk alongside foot soldiers and take a beating. Second, the cruiser tanks. These were the mechanical cavalry, fast, lightly armored, designed to race around the battlefield. This decision resulted in some of the worst tanks ever built. The British saw Christie's suspension and thought, that's perfect for our cruisers. They built the A-13 cruiser. It was fast, 40 miles per hour, but it had almost no armor. Maxing out at 30 millimeters, it could barely stop a heavy machine gun, let alone a tank shell. The test came in 1940, in France. The German blitzkrieg slammed into the British lines. The British cruisers tried to maneuver, tried to use their speed. But in the chaos of real war, speed didn't matter as much as reliability and protection. The British 1st Armoured Division lost 69 tanks in 2 days. Most broke down mechanically. The rest were chewed up by German anti-tank guns. It turns out, if you drive a fast, thin-skinned tank into a hidden gun line, you don't zoom past them, you die. But the British didn't give up on the idea. They looked to the desert of North Africa. Here, surely, in the wide-open sands, the cruiser tank would finally shine. Duel in the desert. In the desert, the British deployed the Crusader. The Crusader is a tragic hero of tank warfare. It looked great. It was low profile and fast. It used that powerful Liberty V12 engine to hit 26 miles per hour across the sand. It was faster than the German tanks it fought. But initially it worked. The Crusader could flank the Germans, hit them from the side, and run away. But the German commander, Rommel, was smart. He stopped trying to fight tank versus tank. He used a tactic called the feigned retreat. He would send out his tanks, they would fire a few shots, and then run away. The fast British Crusaders would chase them, engines roaring, confident in their speed, and they would drive straight into a wall of hidden anti-tank guns. Speed doesn't help you when you are driving into a trap. The Crusader had a fatal flaw. It was unreliable. The desert dust chewed up the engines. The cooling fans broke. At one point, there were more Crusaders broken down on the side of the road than there were fighting the enemy. The British crews bravely fought in these machines, but the verdict was becoming clear. Speed as armor was failing. The Crusaders were popping like balloons when hit. The British were losing the tank war not because they lacked bravery, but because they bet on the wrong quality. They bet on mobility when they should have bet on a gun that worked and armor that held. The Cromwell and the Great Swan. By 1944, the British had one last throw of the dice for the cruiser concept. They built the Cromwell. Now, the Cromwell was special. It finally fixed the engine problem. It was fitted with the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, essentially the same engine that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane fighter planes, just detuned for a tank. This thing had 600 horsepower. In trials, the prototype Cromwells were hitting 50 miles per hour. They actually had to install a governor to limit the speed to 40, just to stop the suspension from ripping itself apart. It arrived just in time for D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. But immediately the Cromwell hit a wall.
Literally. Normandy wasn't an open desert, it was the bocage, thick hedgerows, narrow lanes and small fields. You can't use speed in a traffic jam. The Cromwells were boxed in. German Tiger tanks, which were heavy and slow but had massive guns, sat at the ends of fields and picked them off. In one famous incident, a single German Tiger commander, Michael Wittmann, destroyed an entire column of Cromwells. They were helpless. Speed meant nothing in a confined space. But then the breakout happened. In late summer 1944, the German lines collapsed. The Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across France and Belgium. The British call this the Great Swan. Suddenly, the Cromwell was in its element. It was a race to the German border. The Cromwells were so fast they were outrunning their own supply trucks. They were flanking retreating German columns, jumping canals, yes, literally jumping 20-foot canals, and causing panic in the German rear. For a few glorious weeks, the speed is armor concept worked perfectly, but it only worked because the enemy was already running away. American hot rods. The British weren't the only ones obsessed with speed. The Americans had their own speed demons. Early in the war, the US fielded the M3 Stuart light tank. It was a chaotic little machine. It could do 36 miles per hour and was surprisingly well armored for a light tank. But as the war went on, the US realized light tanks couldn't fight head-to-head with German monsters. So they shifted the doctrine. Light tanks like the M24 Chaffee became scouts. Their job was to find the enemy and then run away to tell the big boys. But there was one American vehicle that took the need for speed to the absolute extreme, the M18 Hellcat. The Hellcat wasn't technically a tank, it was a tank destroyer. The doctrine was simple: speed is everything. The Hellcat had a top speed of 55 miles per hour. It is still the fastest tracked armored vehicle of World War II. It was designed to rush to a breakthrough, ambush enemy tanks with a powerful gun, and then vanish before they could return fire. To achieve this, they stripped almost all the armor off. It had half an inch of protection. A heavy rifle could punch through it. It had an open roof, so the crew was exposed to shrapnel and grenades. But the Hellcat crews loved it. Why? Because it could actually move. It could dance around the heavy German Tigers. There are stories of Hellcats running circles around enemy tanks, firing into their weaker rear armor and speeding off before the German turret could even rotate. It was the ultimate expression of the speed is armor philosophy. But it was a high-stakes game. One mistake, one lucky shot from the enemy, and you were dead. As World War II ended, everyone took a hard look at their tanks. The conclusion was undeniable. Specialization was a bad idea. Having one tank that was slow and tough and another that was fast and weak was a logistical nightmare. You needed a tank that could do it all.
The British created the Centurion. They called it the Universal Tank. It wasn't a race car. It did about 21 miles per hour, but it had great armor and a great gun. It was the grandfather of the modern main battle tank. It proved that being fast enough was better than being the fastest. But the argument wasn't over. In the Cold War, a new split emerged. The British built the Chieftain, a massive, slow slugger with the biggest gun possible and thick armor. They decided that getting hit was inevitable, so you'd better be able to take it. The Germans, however, went the other way. They looked at the new anti-tank technology, heat rounds and guided missiles, and decided that armor was useless. If a missile can penetrate 400 millimeters of steel, why bother carrying the steel? So they built the Leopard 1. It was a throwback to the old cruiser concept: fast, agile, great gun, but paper-thin armor. They bet everything on not getting hit. For a while, it seemed like the Germans might be right, but then technology changed the game again. The modern verdict. So, where are we today? Does the need for speed still dictate tank design? Well, look at the modern monsters. The American M1 Abrams, the British Challenger 2, the German Leopard 2. These tanks are huge. They weigh nearly 70 tons. They have armor that is essentially classified magic, composite materials that can shatter anti-tank rounds. They have guns that can snipe a target from 2 miles away. But here's the kicker. They are also fast. The M1 Abrams uses a gas turbine engine, basically a jet engine in a box, that pumps out 1,500 horsepower. It can hit 45 miles per hour on the road, despite weighing as much as a house. Technology has finally solved the iron triangle. In the past, you had to choose between speed, armor, and firepower. Today, if you have enough money and advanced engineering, you can have all three. But looking back at history, we have to ask, was the speed as armor concept a failure? On balance, probably yes. Sacrificing protection for speed works only in very specific circumstances, when you are chasing a retreating enemy or when you have huge open spaces to maneuver. But war is rarely that clean. War is ambushes, city streets, minefields, and mud. In those conditions, speed vanishes. And if you stripped your armor to get that speed, you're left sitting in a tin can